The Flood versus the Necromorphs, the ultimate clash between two of gaming's most recognisable sets of space zombies. An unstoppable sci-fi nightmare facing off against an immovable cosmic horror. Surely this is a conflict with no clear victor. Well, no, actually, the Flood wins without breaking a sweat. To understand why the Flood are the terrifying top dogs, we need to first look at how both factions function. The Flood is a parasitic supercell which corrupts other organisms. It comes in the form of spores, although it's not entirely clear how effective those are, but its main method of transmission is through physical contact via infection forms designed specifically for that purpose or similar means. Once the supercells are inside a host, living or dead, they replicate and convert whoever's unlucky enough to have come into contact with them into a new and twisted form. The process is quick and it is violent. Just look at this poor marine's transformation in Halo 3. Barring a few miraculous cases, Sergeant Johnson due to his Boren syndrome and Wallace Jenkins who was only partially infected by an aging infection form, there is absolutely no resisting the supercell. If it gets inside you, you will soon turn. As an outbreak continues, the Flood will then use collected biomass to build a proto-gravemind like that seen in Halo Combat Evolved, a new form with far greater intelligence than anything encountered prior. When a proto-gravemind grows big enough, it then becomes a regular gravemind, an enormous monstrosity equipped not only with the knowledge of every creature used to create it, but of every previous gravemind as well.
There is much talk, and I have listened. Through rock and metal and time.
Once the Flood gets to this stage, there is very little stopping them from consuming anything and everything. The Forerunners did create the Halo Array to destroy all life in the galaxy, effectively wiping out their food source. It's an extreme measure, but the only one which guarantees the parasite's defeat. Necromorphs, on the other hand, are reliant on markers to get things going. Black markers, created by the Brethren Moons, give people dementia, which compels them to do one of two things depending on their intelligence. Those less smart off themselves, while others who are sharper will attempt to build replica red markers. Why do they do that? Because the markers transmit a genetic code via a concentrated electromagnetic signal which causes the dead to reanimate in new, hideous forms. Those who end their own lives consequently become necromorphs, while those who build red markers help spread the signal and thus continue the cycle. There are also specialised necromorphs designed for speeding up the infection process, something best witnessed at the beginning of Dead Space 2.
Listen, you're in terrible danger.
Once enough necromorphs have been created, a convergence event is triggered. The monsters gather around a marker, at which point a huge amount of energy is released, throwing all that necrotic tissue and parts of the planet under attack into the air, where it all then combines to create a Brethren Moon. The moons can communicate telepathically, they can travel across vast distances, they can manipulate any species they come into contact with, and they're also gigantic. No civilization has been able to completely stop them, as far as we know, humanity included. During Dead Space 3, it's also revealed that the aliens inhabiting the planet of Tau Volantis did manage to temporarily halt the Necromorph Scourge by freezing their entire planet, but that was only a temporary measure, with visiting humans managing to trigger further outbreaks there on 2 separate occasions. The obvious and really uninteresting answer to the question at hand is that who emerges victorious depends on whether the Flood is susceptible to the marker's signal, or if necromorphs are affected by the Flood's supercell. Whichever is weak to the other will lose. So, just for the purposes of this video, we're going to assume neither has any effect on their enemy. Looking at a confrontation between the two in terms of small, medium and large-scale conflicts, it's not unreasonable to think that the Flood wins every single one. But a small outbreak would certainly be where the two factions would be most evenly matched, especially during the very early stages of an outbreak. Working off the assumption that lots of people are offing themselves so the necromorphs have a plentiful supply of dead bodies to infect. and the Flood are busily working away converting anything living or dead they find, any early battles between the two would be relatively even. The Flood would have it far easier building their ranks as time progressed though, as all it really takes for everything to get out of hand is a few spores, while the Necromorphs require a constant supply of corpses. Frankly, it's much harder for the Necromorphs to build any initial momentum. In terms of the nightmarish creatures each faction sends onto the battlefield, is pretty close. For every Flood combat form there's an equally ferocious slasher, for every Necromorph lurker there's a Flood ranged form, and many of each side's other abominations also cancel each other out. In fact, you could even go so far as to say that the Necromorphs have a little more versatility early doors if you were to choose between the two. However, what the Necromorphs can't do is make use of the combined knowledge of everyone they've converted, which means the Flood will almost immediately begin taking advantage of weapons. Once the Flood begin doing that, any hope of a Necromorph victory all but evaporates. Yes, Dead Space's villains have some pretty horrendous monsters they can call upon, but they're also extremely susceptible to gunfire if it hits their limbs. Flood without weapons, sure, there's a world where the Necromorphs have a slim chance of an upset. When the Flood get their hands, tentacles, on weapons, you can all but call it a day, as they'll soon learn how easily their enemies succumb once their arms and legs have been removed. Remember too that the Flood would also absorb the knowledge of someone who knew how to use stasis and kinesis, adding an extra issue for the Necromorphs to deal with. While the Necromorphs do use basic strategy, especially when a hive mind is in play, as we'll get to in a jiffy, once the Flood have killed a few Necromorphs, they'll begin to figure out how to effectively counter them using the aforementioned tools. The counter-argument would be that the Flood are still relatively feral and would perhaps not yet be quite intelligent enough to do that, but even during the early stages of the outbreak on Installation 04, they had enough cunning to lure Master Chief inside the weapons cache so they could ambush him. So there is still some strategizing going on, even when an outbreak has only just begun. It should also be acknowledged that the Necromorphs do use some tools, but at a rudimentary level at best. In Dead Space 3, for example, there are some which wield pickaxes or are sort of able to fire guns, albeit without really being able to aim, but their abilities pale in comparison to what the Flood can do. When it comes to a small-scale outbreak, at the end of the day, we need only look at the events which unfolded on Installation 04 during Halo Combat Evolved, and on Titan Station during Dead Space 2. On Installation 04, the Flood were released, and within hours they'd brought the UNSC and the Covenant, two technologically advanced species, to their knees, and they'd constructed a proto-gravemind partially made up of Captain Jacob Keyes, presumably so they could pilot a Covenant ship off the ring to find new sources of food.
No human life signs detected. The captain, he's one of them.
Master Chief managed to destroy the ring to put an end to the infestation, but it was a close-run thing, and it got very out of hand in an extremely short space of time. The outbreak, which unfolded across Titan Station, was equally rapid, but in general humans seemed to have much more of a fighting chance. Granted, in the residential and shopping districts, residents didn't seem to have much luck. But there are still pockets of survivors hunkered down right until near the very end of Dead Space 2. If the Necromorphs were replaced by the Flood, the entire settlement would have been overrun in half the time or less. By the time you reach a medium-scale outbreak, say a conflict between the gruesome twosome covering an entire planet, it's safe to say the Flood will be on the verge of victory if they've not already triumphed some time ago. Forget about simply using guns, the Flood would have access to, and be able to use, any technology found on the planet in question. During the Halo trilogy, we saw them pilot ground vehicles and spaceships, and the only real limit to their capabilities is the amount of knowledge they can consume. Whatever technology exists, you can be almost certain the Flood will be able to utilize it. By comparison, the Necromorphs have pretty much topped out in terms of power scaling by this point. Whatever you experience towards the start of an outbreak isn't going to be drastically dissimilar from what you come across during the latter stages of one. Long story short, they aren't suddenly going to start wielding weird and wonderful weapons or turn up piloting a plane, a ship, or similar. Each will have also begun building larger variants, and again the Necromorphs stand very little chance. On their side, one or more hive minds might be built. The hive mind's ability to coordinate necromorphs adds a degree of strategy to their approach, but a commander is only as strong as the troops they command, and by this point the hive mind soldiers are far outclassed by the technologically adept Flood. Remember too that Dead Space protagonist Isaac Clarke managed to defeat a hive mind on his own. He thwarted the necromorphs as a whole on several occasions, and he even defeated a Brethren Moon, albeit a newly awoken one. Compare that to the Flood, who will have at least constructed a proto-Gravemind, but will more likely be on their way to building a full-fat Gravemind.
Those who built this place knew what they wrought. Do not mistake their intent, or all will perish as they did before.
Like the Necromorph hive minds, a Gravemind is able to command its armies, but crucially, it is also equipped with the knowledge of every host the Flood has ever assimilated. Ever, as in over tens of thousands of years, back to the time of the Precursors and the Forerunners, to extraordinarily technologically advanced civilizations. In terms of intelligence, a hive mind is an ant compared to a Gravemind's Albert Einstein. Master Chief, humanity's greatest soldier, was unable to get even close to thwarting one alone, unlike Isaac did with a hive mind. Honestly, our favourite super soldier was but a plaything in the face of such unimaginable power. At this stage, there is little that can be done to stop the Flood other than firing a halo array, and the only way to present any form of counter-offensive involves an entire species or multiple species teaming up to fight back. When it comes to conflict on a galactic scale, there is unfortunately no real comparison, although this one is a little unfair. The Flood will now be able to freely explore the stars, they will have an understanding of all technology any host they've ever absorbed has encountered, and they will be able to wield science in a manner none will have ever encountered. That includes neural physics, essentially badly explained space magic that never really appears in the Halo games themselves, which gives the Flood access to things like star roads, structures used to move between galaxies which warp the very fabric of space-time itself. Again, barring the use of a halo array to destroy them, they are practically unstoppable. We've seen a lot of what the Flood can do in Halo's games, and we know even more about their capabilities thanks to the wealth of extended universe content. What the Necromorphs are capable of once Brethren Moons come into play might well be left unclear indefinitely, as it doesn't look like there's a whole lot of Dead Space content on the horizon. The last we saw of them was their attack on Earth at the end of Dead Space 3's DLC Awakened, and where their capabilities would probably have been greatly expanded upon in any subsequent Dead Space titles, we never ended up getting any, and so have no idea how strong they would eventually become, or exactly what their full range of abilities are. Even so, the Brethren Moons would have to be capable of some pretty bananas stuff to stand any hope of victory given how powerful the Flood can potentially become. We've seen no suggestion that the Necromorphs are able to fully utilise technology in the present, let alone the almost otherworldly advancements the Flood have access to, and so it seems very unlikely they'd be able to scale up enough to provide any significant challenge to the Flood's dominance. If the Necromorphs hadn't already been defeated long ago, by this point they're little more than an intergalactic nuisance for the Flood. In the end, I think the main takeaway from this video should be that there needs to be a crossover event where the Necromorphs enter Halo's universe or vice versa. Both series have floundered somewhat in recent years, despite the Dead Space remake being fantastic and Halo Infinite being fairly decent, so now is the perfect time to merge them into one mega franchise. Dead Halo, Halo Space, battle against the Necroflood. I'm ready for Master Chief and Isaac Clarke to team up to kick some zombie space arse. In all seriousness though, both the Flood and the Necromorphs are awesome and deserve to be held in equally high regard. However, it's a crying shame that we likely won't see much more of either of them for a very long time. Thanks for watching the video, boys, girls, Spartans and engineers. If you had a disturbingly good time, do consider liking, subscribing and sharing your thoughts, and hopefully we'll catch up again soon.